everyone. So we've talked about how populations evolve. Now we're going to talk about how biological diversity evolves. So take a moment to look at and read through this little comic strip. Pause the video if you need to, but I'm going to move on. Okay, so we talked about microevolution. Now we're going to focus on macroevolution. This looks at large-scale changes in the fossil record and includes the multiplication of species. A focal point of this macroevolution is speciation, which is the process in which one species splits into two or more species. There are two contrasting patterns, though, which we'll talk about. This right here is an example of different salamanders in California that all resulted from speciation. And so notice how they're all in different parts of California too, by their color coding. Anyways, one of the two contrasting patterns is non-branching speciation, where a population changes to become a new species. So this population is changing to become this species. Whereas in branching evolution, which is what I just mentioned, where a species splits and branches into one or two or more new species, it's important to mention that the parent species can continue to exist. So just because speciation occurs doesn't mean the original or parent species ceases to exist. To really understand this, let's discuss where the word species comes from. It's a Latin word that means kind or appearance, and it's basically just a population or a group of populations in which the individual can breed with one another naturally, so regularly in nature, and their offspring. So these individuals that are breeding together will have offspring that are fertile, so their offspring will be able to find mates to produce more offspring, and so on. Ernst Mayr was an ornithologist. This means he studied birds. He led this expedition to New Guinea and found this tremendous diversity in birds. And he collected, just like Darwin did, he collected a ton of samples. He collected different samples of birds, thousands actually. His specialty, if you will, was discovering new birds. And he distilled these different diversities of birds into something called the biological species concept. This biological species concept defines species as groups of interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from other such groups. So, for example, here in A with these two birds, we have actually two different species of birds that look amazingly similar, but they cannot interbreed, so they can't breed with each other. Then in B, we have this amazing diversity within our own species, and no matter our diversity, we can interbreed. Some situations this concept does not work in is in organisms reproducing asexually. They are not reproducing with another. They're producing offspring from a single parent, so they're essentially producing a clone. And it doesn't work with fossils, with the fossil record, because fossils are obviously not currently reproducing their fossils. And to make up for that, biologists have come up with other ways to define species. For example, based on measurable physical characteristics or molecular data, so both things we've already discussed in previous chapters. We've talked about how breeding occurs within a species. Now let's discuss some reproductive barriers between species. So how species remain separate. So this could be through prezygotic or postzygotic barriers. And we're about to get into some details of that. Just remember, pre means before, post means after, and a zygote is a fertilized egg. So pre-fertilized egg, before fertilized egg and post fertilized egg, so after egg fertilization occurs with post-zygotic. Pre-zygotic barriers stop or prevent mating between species. This could be due to temporal isolation. This is time-based. So, for example, western skunks breed in the fall, whereas eastern species breed in late winter. So that's what it means by time isolation, different breeding times. Then we have habitat isolation. So when species live in the same region but not the same habitat, for example, garter snakes that live in water versus garter snakes that are land dwelling. Then we have behavioral isolation. These are traits that allow other members to recognize potential mates. Different examples include bird courtship behaviors. We'll look at a picture of one of these in a minute. Then we have mechanical isolation, where egg and sperm producing body parts, so the actual body parts, are not anatomically compatible. And we have gametic isolation, where the actual gametes, the sex cells, the egg and the sperm aren't compatible. So this is that example of behavioral isolation. These birds are called blue-footed boobies. They only mate after a courtship behavior of high stepping to show off their bright blue feet. So the males will high step to advertise and show off to the female. They'll be like, hey, choose me, I'm the bluest footed booby out here. And the female will choose who she deems the best mate available. So we just talked about all kinds of pre-zygotic barriers. Now we're on to post-zygotic. This is where interspecies, so between species, inter means between. Intra means within, so before it was when we talk about intraspecies, we're talking about within the same species, whereas interspecies is between different species. But anyways, post-zygotic, this is where interspecies breeding happens and the resulting offspring is a hybrid. So these hybrids could be inviable or sterile. Inviability means that offspring will die before getting to reproductive maturity, so these hybrids will die before reaching an age where they can reproduce. And then hybrid sterility means these hybrid offspring can become adults, but they will be infertile. They will not be able to have their own offspring. So for example, mules are hybrids between donkeys and horses, but they are sterile. They cannot successfully breed. And this is a nice little chart for you to read through, basically mapping out what I just talked about. Now on to the mechanisms of speciation. So it says, a key event in the potential origin of species occurs when a population is somehow severed from other populations of the parent species. So new species arise when one population is cut off from another population. With this isolated gene pool, the new cut off population can go down its own evolutionary trajectory. So there can be different changes in different frequencies of alleles caused by genetic drift and natural selection, if you remember back to microevolution from the previous chapter. Speciation can result from the following instances. The first one is allopatric speciation. In example A, you can see allopatric speciation has to do with some kind of geographic barrier. And then we have sympatric, which is the origin of a new species without geographic isolation, and that is pictured in B right there. So geological factors can fragment a population into 2+ populations, which contributes to this mode of allopatric speciation. And this down here at the bottom is an example of the antelope squirrel, which is found on the southern rim of the Grand Canyon, and the white-tailed antelope squirrel, which is found on the northern rim. And it looks like a geographic barrier happened here due to the squirrel finding the canyon an impassable barrier. Makes sense, right? Oh, too fast. Okay. It's important, though, to state that just because an isolated population survives, it does not mean it'll form a new species. Speciation occurs only with the evolution of reproductive barriers between the isolated population and its parent population. And we have sympatric speciation, which happens if a genetic change causes a reproductive barrier between the population experiencing the genetic change, so the mutation, and the original parent population. And a new species can arise from something called polyploidy. Polyploidy happens due to accidents during cell division that may lead to sympatric speciation. This down here is an example of a plant. We have two different species, species A, species B, and they result in a sterile hybrid. And the hybrid may go through asexual reproduction, as many plants can, and eventually form a new species via polyploidy. So many domesticated plants result from sympatric speciation. Some that you're familiar with are oats, potatoes, strawberries, peanuts, sugarcane. Your book lists off some more. What is the tempo of speciation? So traditional evolutionary trees depict this gradual divergence with a descent of species. With this insect, you can see a gradual change over time. Whoops, there we go. You can see a gradual change over time until we get to two new species, right? Well, we have a contrasting mode. We have this model called punctuated equilibrium, and it states that species most often diverge in spurts of rapid change, and this takes into account those transitional species we were talking about, like Tiktaalik, which was the transitional species between a fish and a land-dwelling animal, and then Archaeopteryx, the transitional species between reptiles and birds, and how this takes into account how relatively rare these transitional species are in comparison to other fossils. This is what punctuated equilibrium would look like. So you can see spurts of rapid change, and it looks different from that traditional gradual model. You can definitely see how it's happening quickly and then tapering off. Now let's move on to the evolution of novelty. Novel structures, novel just means new, novelty means new structures. So this evolution of novelty refers to adaptations of old structures for new or novel functions. For example, birds come from a lineage of reptiles that could not fly. They were earthbound, so how did they develop flight? Discovering the Archaeopteryx fossil gave us insight to that question, given all of the reptilian features in this extinct bird. But in 1996 came the definitive answer that dinosaurs were the first feathered animals on Earth. And this leads to the term exaptation. Structures such as feathers that evolved in one context but become useful for another function. Flight, in this case, would be a great example. And this happens gradually. And again, it's not forward thinking. Exaptations don't anticipate future reuse. Remember, natural selection it can't predict the future. It only improves the existing structure in the context of its current use. Remember, survival of the fittest does not mean the strongest brute force survives. It means the ones with the best traits suitable for their environment survive to reproduce, and then they'll have offspring with the best traits, and those offspring will survive to reproduce, and eventually these gradual changes will occur. This brings us to the idea of evo-devo, evolutionary and developmental novelties, so how new structures arise from the slightest of genetic change. Pedomorphosis is a great example. This is an axolotl, and it is a pedomorph. It retained its juvenile features into adulthood. It grows to full size, and it reproduces, and it doesn't lose its external gills, which is pretty much a juvenile characteristic in other salamanders. And this pedomorphosis is also called neoteny, and it's actually important in human evolution as well, this retention of juvenile characteristics. Humans and chimpanzees are very much alike in fetus form. Their skulls are round, jaws are small, they both have pretty flat faces, and as they develop, there's an accelerated growth in different parts of the skull compared to each other. But when we look at the brain, compared to the brain of the chimpanzee, the human brain continues to grow for several years longer, which is considered a prolonged juvenile process. With Mickey, you can see how he's changed over the years. As time went on, Mickey started looking younger, he got a larger head, larger eyes, and these are all considered juvenile traits. Now we are moving on to the history of the Earth and macroevolution, which are very closely linked. The geologic time frame in the fossil record is basically the archive or the library of or for macroevolution. Geologists have come up with a geologic time scale that we're going to talk about. So first we have the longest time period called the Precambrian. Just look at how long this takes place in comparison to everything else. It's about 80%. 80% of this geologic time scale is the Precambrian. We have pretty little diversity here, but by the end we get soft-bodied invertebrates. So right here, diverse soft-bodied invertebrate animals. Then we have the Cambrian explosion right here, where tons of modern animal phyla started coming up. More plants, more jawless fish. Then we have the Devonian up here, which is mainly classified by fishes. Then we have some reptiles and amphibians. On to tetrapods. Tetra means four, pods are feet, so four-footed animals. These are land animals. Moving towards reptiles on land. Then we move on to the Mesozoic era. So we have the Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous periods. Most people have heard about this. These are our dinosaur times. So here we have dinosaurs, we have gymnosperms as the dominant plants. These are cone-bearing trees like pine trees. We have some angiosperms, which are flowering plants. They start to appear. And then we move on to mammals, birds. Angiosperms start becoming more dominant, those flowering plants. Primates, and then about 5 million years ago, we start getting ape-like ancestors of humans, and then about 1.8 million years ago, humans started appearing. How to remember this? Camels only sit down carefully. Perhaps their joints creak. So Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous, Permian, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous. Camels only sit down carefully, perhaps their joints creak is the best way to remember the order from oldest to most recent. Well, tertiary and quaternary. Quaternary is the most recent. That's where we're in right now. So that geologic timescale goes along with plate tectonics, so how the continents shifted from Pangea, and we discussed this last chapter. When Pangea broke up, speciation started occurring due to geologic barriers and then over time evolution. So this is another refresher of the last chapter we talked about this in. So the fossil record shows long periods of stability broken by mass extinctions. But afterwards, there were these huge booms in new species formations, and this fits better with the punctuated equilibrium model of evolution with these big spurts. The best known mass extinction happened during the Cretaceous period, about 65 million years ago. Most people remember this with the meteor impact that contributed to the extinction of the dinosaurs. And this allowed small mammals to diversify, very rodent-like mammals. So all the niches that dinos previously occupied were now open, and mammals were given the opportunity to diversify into tons of new species. And we use systematics to classify these different species. This is the study of biological diversity. And then taxonomy is the naming classification of different species. And it can get pretty specific. Linnaeus is the founder of taxonomy. He found the formal naming system, genus, species. We call it Linnaean taxonomy or binomial nomenclature. So that's again the genus species where Homo sapiens, dogs are Canis familiaris. And it basically shows us how closely plants and animals are related to each other. Alright, so this is what I was just talking about, this two-part naming system. It's called binomial nomenclature again. We have humans, Homo sapiens, we have cats, Felix domesticus, and we have dogs, Canis familiaris, as different examples. Notice it's always italicized. The genus is always capitalized, the species is not. If you write them down, then underline. If you're typing, always italicize the genus and species. Let's look at the taxonomic hierarchy. We go from pretty broad, general, there at the bottom, to extremely specific, there at the top. So we're going from the bottom up right now. Here, we're in the cat family, so the panther. We have the three domains of life, archaea, bacteria, eukarya. We're in domain eukarya, kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, so chordates, which we'll talk about more later. We are class Mammalia. This is a mammal. Order Carnivora, it's a carnivore. Family Felidae, genus Panthera, species Panthera pardus. Each of these tiers tells us where the species fits. Lions would be the same, except their species would be Leo, so they'd be Panthera leo. And remember, the way to remember domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species is Dear King Philip came over for great spaghetti. And in this hierarchy, we'd be, if we were looking at Homo sapiens, if we're looking at ourselves, we would be the same up until mammals. So we're eukaryotes, we're animals, we're chordates, we're mammals, but then our order, family, genus, and species would be different. The goal of classifying is to see how things are related, so to reflect phylogeny, in other words. Here's a phylogenetic tree of carnivores, and everything is related, but as you move down, the branches, you can see how closely related things are. The more closely related ones would be more closely linked, and then the ones that are further apart, as you can tell by the branches on the tree, will be less closely linked, less closely related. We have to look at homologous structures. Remember, homology means came from the same ancestor. Homo means one. While homologous structures are structures that are similar because they came from a common ancestor. Remember our example about arm bones in different animals from the previous chapter? Those were called homologous structures. So bone structures and forelimbs of bats and whales, for example. You can also have convergent evolution with analogous structures. So I remember this by A con. So A, analogous, con, convergent. Analogous structures with convergent evolution. Homologous structures with divergent, HD. Homologous, divergent. Analogous with convergent, A con. These are structures that are similar due to the similar environment these organisms are living in. So they're trying to solve the same problem, so they converge upon the same solution. This is one example, bat wing, a bird wing, a pterodactyl wing, and a moth wing. And then another example would be the similar structures in dolphins and sharks. Sharks are cartilaginous fish, dolphins are mammals, but they have similar structures due to the similar environment in which they dwell. We also have molecular systematics. So it compares the DNA and amino acid sequences, and this is where we'd see those different mutations and can reveal evolutionary relationships. Then cladistics shows us distinctive branches in history. So this is the most common example. And this is just saying, so here are different groups: leopard, turtle, salamander, tuna, lamprey, lancelet. And then we have this vertebral column, so every single branch after this characteristic has a vertebral column. Every branch after this jaw characteristics has a jaw. However, the lampreys and lancelets do not have a jaw. Notice that if it's before, it doesn't. So the lancelet does not have a vertebral column, but the lamprey, tuna, salamander, turtle, and leopard do. And then notice with hair, only the leopard has hair, everything else doesn't. And that's how you would read that. You just look at the little behind that characteristic has that characteristic. And this shows us big important steps that differentiate different parts of life. So vertebral columns, jaws, 4 walking legs, amniotic eggs, hair, these are all really important things that happened. And each gets more and more specific. You'll have outgroups, and then you have in-groups. So you can obviously see why the reptile is the outgroup here, because the in-group are all mammals. So cladistics has changed how we classify common ancestors. And that's really interesting. It's not a bad thing. We're always trying to get a better understanding of everything. And kingdoms, for example, are always getting updated. This is the 5-kingdom system, so it ranges life into kingdoms based on specific characteristics from Monera, Protista, Plantae, Fungi, and Animalia. And then we have the 3-domain system, which is what we're going by here, with bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And it's an alternative to the 5-kingdom system. And again, super important, so I will restate it. Theory is a very important word. The word theory refers to something that's withstood a lot of experimentation. Everything published is peer-reviewed. And this is evolution. This is a unifying idea of biology and universally accepted in the science world. Super important. And that's all for chapter 14.